shortly before her death, the former Graceland maid who spent 10 years within Elvis Presley's inner circle finally broke her silence, and what she revealed shocked fans everywhere. For more than 4 decades, Nancy Rooks kept the king's secrets, never speaking about what truly happened behind Graceland's closed doors. But in her final days, her words made headlines. "It's time to tell everything," she said. What followed wasn't the kind tribute people had expected. In her last moments, Nancy exposed a more complicated truth about Elvis, raising questions about what she had seen and why she stayed quiet for so long. Inside Graceland, Nancy witnessed a life far removed from the spotlight. She didn't know Elvis as the world did. Instead, she met him in house slippers, yawning in the kitchen and asking if there was any bacon left. Hired in 1967 as a maid and cook, her role soon became much more personal. Over time, she became a quiet presence in his private life, witnessing everything from relaxed breakfasts to private emotional breakdowns. Graceland was more than a mansion, it was a place of shifting moods. Some nights Elvis would silently roam the halls at 2 a.m., on others, the house was alive with gospel music as he and Nancy sang together in the kitchen. "How Great Thou Art" was his favorite, and he'd smile when she joined in, towel in one hand and frying pan in the other. To the world, he was a superstar. To Nancy, he was Mr. Elvis, always respectful, always polite. Despite the chaos of ringing phones and constant visitors, he treated her kindly. Still, life at Graceland was anything but ordinary. Nancy worked unusual hours to match Elvis's unpredictable routines. If he wanted bacon, biscuits, or sweet potato pie at 3 a.m., she was there without complaint. Her duties went far beyond cleaning. She helped him get dressed, arranged his belongings, prepped the pool area, and adapted to a lifestyle where day and night had no boundaries. She quietly witnessed more than anyone realized. Years later, she wrote a memoir, Inside Graceland, Elvis's Maid Remembers, filled with fond, gentle stories, never gossip or judgment. Yet even then, she admitted in hushed interviews that there were truths she kept to herself, not out of fear, but loyalty. Fans clung to her every word, desperate to know what Elvis was like behind closed doors, what he ate, how he dressed, how he acted when no one was watching. Nancy shared just enough to maintain the mystique while still shielding the man behind the legend. She described his obsession with cleanliness, how he showered multiple times a day, liked his bacon crisp and his eggs just right, and how his eyes always scanned the room, even in exhaustion, as if searching for something missing. But more than trivia, Nancy gave the world something deeper, perspective. Her stories reminded people that Elvis was human, not just a cultural icon or tragic figure, but a man who laughed, cried, overindulged, and sometimes wanted solitude. Despite his fame, he kept a small group close, and Nancy had a quiet but meaningful place in that circle. She never sought the spotlight, but as the end neared, she began hinting at hidden truths, fragments of his story she'd kept buried. When she finally said, "It's time to tell everything," those closest to her began to wonder what she'd been holding back all these years. What had she witnessed that remained unspoken? On the morning of August 16, 1977, things seemed routine. Elvis had stayed up late, playing racquetball with his fiancée Ginger Alden and cousin Billy Smith. When he returned to Graceland in the early hours, Nancy was already in the kitchen. She remembered him standing on the stairs, tired, yet still kind, and, like always, she offered him breakfast. "I don't want anything to eat right now," Elvis said. "I just want to sleep. But I would like some water." Nancy didn't think much of it. After all, it was a hot night, and Elvis had been active. She asked Pauline, another maid, to take some ice water upstairs in an old juice jug with a handle. It seemed like a small, ordinary moment in a house full of them. But Pauline sensed something unusual. Elvis grabbed the jug and drank urgently, fast and almost frantically. "I never saw him drink water like that," she later recalled. Nancy dismissed it at the time. "He's probably just tired from racquetball," she said. Still, the moment lingered quietly in her thoughts. Around 9:30 a.m., Nancy heard a dull thud from upstairs. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, no crash, no screams, no commotion, just an eerie stillness. She hesitated, listened, and then convinced herself it was nothing and returned to her tasks. Hours passed. Then, at about 1:50 p.m., the intercom buzzed. Ginger's voice came through, unsteady and nearly inaudible. "Who's down there? Something bad has happened up here." Nancy froze. "What is it?" she asked. Ginger broke into tears. That was when Nancy knew this wasn't a minor accident. She dropped the phone and ran upstairs, her heart racing. She turned into the hallway, then the dressing room, and finally into the bathroom, where she found Elvis face down, still and lifeless. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is this?" She didn't scream or panic. She turned and ran downstairs, alerting the Memphis Mafia. The urgency grew. The house began to spiral into confusion. An ambulance was called. Panic set in for many, but not for Nancy. When the paramedics arrived and didn't know their way through Graceland, she guided them. She helped them carry the stretcher up the narrow staircase and through the tight corridors. When they finally brought Elvis down, Nancy caught one last glimpse of him. He looked like he was sleeping, she would say later, but he had already passed. There were blue spots on his face. Everything afterward blurred: sirens, media, people gathering. The world lost Elvis Presley. Nancy lost Mr. Elvis, the man who once asked her to hem his pants while joking around. She stayed quiet as headlines spread. The official cause was cardiac arrest, simple, final. But questions lingered. People whispered about pills, about timing, about what really happened between that early morning drink of water and the moment she found him. Nancy didn't speak up then. She let the investigators do their work. But years later, she would revisit that day, not just the facts but her own doubts, regrets, and unspoken suspicions. Some secrets she'd kept without realizing it. For years after Elvis's death, Nancy Rooks kept her thoughts to herself. Not because she had nothing to say, she did, but because there were boundaries you didn't cross in Memphis, especially after working for someone like Elvis. She'd seen fans travel from far away just to stand outside Graceland, watch them cry over someone they felt deeply connected to. Nancy understood that grief, she felt it too. And maybe that's why she chose silence instead of speculation. But silence can carry weight. Nancy remained with the Presley family and helped transform Graceland from a private home into a public museum. Still, one part of the house stayed off limits: Elvis's private upstairs quarters. According to Nancy, those rooms were cleaned only occasionally, just enough to keep dust away. There was an unspoken rule: no lingering, no questions. Go in, clean, and leave. Yet every time she stepped inside, something shifted. She'd see the same hallway, the same floor, the same bathroom. The same spot where it all ended. As she folded clothes or wiped a surface, memories of that morning would come flooding back. She didn't speak much about it publicly. Her memoir from the 1990s, Inside Graceland, Elvis's Maid Remembers, was warm and filled with stories: his favorite foods, quirky habits, late nights. But the final chapter, the one everyone wanted to understand, remained strangely quiet. For most of the public, that was enough. But for those who truly knew her, Nancy had her moments, small, telling signs. She would pause in conversations when certain topics came up, her gaze drifting. On one occasion, she reportedly said, "If people knew what I know, they'd never hear his music the same again." It wasn't a threat. It was a waiting game. Over the years, questions began to surface. Why was the timeline of Elvis's death so unclear? Why were several prescription bottles supposedly removed from the scene before investigators arrived? Why did the toxicology report undergo so many revisions before being released to the public? And why did those who were present, like Nancy, remain silent about those inconsistencies? The truth is, she tried to speak, quietly and carefully. A few close friends claimed she had confided in them, always urging discretion. She mentioned that there were items in that bathroom that didn't belong, things Ginger Alden was too shaken to explain, and things the Memphis Mafia didn't want the police looking into. One account even suggests Nancy was asked to clean up the room before paramedics arrived, though she never confirmed this. Time didn't make her bitter, it made her weary. When she was diagnosed with health issues in her later years, something shifted. In an interview a year before her passing, she said, "I did my duty for the family, but I think someday before I go, the truth needs to be told." It wasn't a threat. It was a release. Many believed she shared everything in her memoir. But what if the most crucial detail was the one she withheld? What if she saw more that morning than she ever admitted? What if her silence wasn't only about loyalty, but also about guilt? In the decades after Elvis's death, Nancy's final words began to feel more urgent than nostalgic. She had dedicated her life to preserving the image of the man she worked for. But in the end, she suggested that protecting his legacy might have meant hiding something, and she was no longer certain that had been the right choice. Just before her death in 2022, Nancy made a quiet but powerful confession. She didn't go public or seek attention, that wasn't her way. But those closest to her noticed a change in her final months. She became more introspective, more candid, and eventually said something no one expected from someone who had guarded Elvis's secrets for over 40 years. "It's time to tell everything." At first, people weren't sure what she meant. But it soon became clear, she was ready to let go, not for recognition, but for peace. Nancy had always told the heartwarming stories, the charming details, the familiar routines that made fans feel close to Elvis. But she had kept one part locked away, what she truly believed happened in those final days. A friend later shared that Nancy had confided Elvis hadn't been well for weeks before his death, much worse than the public ever knew. He was worn down. She said he was exhausted, tired of the medications, tired of pretending. She also claimed some of the drugs he was taking weren't prescribed for him, and that pills were being circulated among those around him without proper supervision. Nancy said she noticed new bottles appearing in the trash daily that summer, and that more than once, Elvis had dozed off mid-conversation, mid-meal, even mid-sentence. She had thought it was just fatigue. In hindsight, she feared it was something more. She also finally spoke about the moment after Elvis was found. When Ginger called downstairs in tears, Nancy rushed up. She saw him lying face down, unresponsive, and froze before springing into action to alert others. But before the ambulance arrived, someone, she never said who, asked her to clean up a bit. She didn't question it. She wiped a counter, straightened a towel, moved some things. It seemed harmless. But later, as the media frenzy erupted and questions mounted about pills and timelines, she began to understand the implications. "I didn't know what I was covering up," she reportedly said. "I just did what I was told." Those moments, the water he drank too quickly, the sound she heard that morning, the subtle tidying, stayed with her. For years, the memory of that moment lingered in her mind. Nancy told herself it meant nothing, but in her final months, doubt crept in. That's when she finally shared something she had never spoken aloud, not even in her book, a truth that now casts a new light on everything. Elvis didn't just die, he faded. And no one stopped it. That haunting thought stayed with her, and those closest to her noticed that in her last days, she seemed weighed down, not by what she had done, but by what she had left unsaid. Had her silence protected Elvis? Or had it protected those who allowed his decline? With that quiet confession, everything changed. Before her death, the once reserved Graceland housekeeper revealed a version of events that reshaped the narrative. It wasn't about Elvis being a bad man, it was about the possibility that those around him had failed him. Nancy had seen too many warning signs and spent too long pretending she hadn't. When the world learned that Nancy Rooks had left behind more than recipes and warm recollections, the reaction wasn't explosive. It crept in subtly, like she once had through the halls of Graceland, quiet but aware. But once people began to understand what she had said, or implied, shock rippled out. Fans were torn. Some refused to accept it, believing her earlier memoir was the definitive, loyal tribute to a man they cherished. But now, that same loyal housekeeper had said Elvis didn't simply collapse, he faded. Worse still, she hinted that she might have unknowingly contributed to efforts that cleaned up the scene before authorities arrived. That suggestion, that evidence may have been tampered with, even unintentionally, reopened old wounds. Elvis's official cause of death had always left questions. A sudden heart attack, yes, but the drugs in his system, the delay in calling an ambulance, and the absence of a complete toxicology report fueled new suspicion. Online communities erupted in speculation. Researchers and biographers revisited the timeline. What exactly had Nancy witnessed that morning? Was she told to clean something up? Why wait so long to speak? And did someone tell her to keep quiet? Others saw her revelation as an act of bravery. To them, Nancy's truth was not a betrayal, but a final gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that preserving someone's legacy doesn't mean hiding the hard parts. She showed that Elvis wasn't untouchable, that even legends can unravel, slowly and in silence, surrounded by people too afraid to act. The Presley estate stayed silent, tours continued, merchandise sold, music played. But those who had known Nancy whispered that things had changed. A boundary had been crossed, not out of malice, but out of love for a man they once called family. Nancy never sought attention. There were no interviews or best-selling exposés, just a few heartfelt words passed quietly through people she trusted. And somehow, those words hit harder than any breaking story. She didn't accuse. She didn't name names. She simply told her truth. And that truth forced the world to see Elvis's life and death differently, not as a sudden tragedy, but as a slow descent that too many witnessed and no one stopped. Nancy had always lived in the background, but in the end, her voice stepped into the spotlight. She didn't leave behind a scandal. She left behind heavy questions, the kind that linger long after the news cycle moves on. Her goal wasn't to tarnish Elvis's image. If anything, she wanted to protect the man she remembered, the one who sang gospel in the kitchen and liked his bacon crispy. Still, truth has a way of breaking through even the most carefully preserved stories. Nancy didn't pretend to have all the answers. She wasn't a doctor or an investigator. She was a maid, a cook, and a quiet witness to something far bigger than herself. That's why her story carried such weight, because it came from someone who had simply been there. And when she finally said, "It's time to tell everything," it wasn't an accusation, it was a recognition that silence, even when well-intentioned, can feel like betrayal. For decades, Nancy believed that staying quiet honored Elvis. But with time, she saw that honoring someone also means being honest. Her final message left behind a more complex image, not just of Elvis, but of the world he inhabited, a world of unchecked prescriptions, unquestioned habits, and people too afraid to speak up. Fans who thought they knew the full story were forced to reconsider, not because of a grand revelation, but because Nancy showed what it's like to live with the guilt of what you didn't stop, even when you didn't understand it. Her final reflections weren't meant to change Elvis's legacy, but to remind us that even icons are human, and those around them are too. That grief can harden into silence, and silence can stretch over decades. Sometimes, telling the truth isn't about blame, it's about freeing yourself from a burden you've carried alone for too long. Now Nancy is gone. The woman who folded his shirts, brought him water that morning, and guided the paramedics upstairs is no longer here to clarify. But her voice remains, in soft admissions, in incomplete thoughts, and in her choice to speak up once before the end. And maybe, that was her most powerful act of all. Did Nancy Rooks wait too long to speak, or was that final confession the only true way to honor the man she never stopped protecting?